Swami Raj Prabhupada ki jai, Anand Koti Vaishnavrinda ki jai, Namacharya Sridhar Das Thakur ki jai, Prem se kaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaur Bhaktivinoda ki jai, Sri Sri Radha Krishna Govinath Sham Kund Radha Kunikiti Govardhan ki jai, Vrindavan Dham ki jai, Navadip Dham ki jai, Jagannath Puri ki jai, Kangamai ki jai, Jamanamai ki jai, Tulsi Devi ki jai, Bhakti Devi ki jai, Samavita Bhaktivinoda ki jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. Gaur Prema Nande. Om Janatimirandasya Viranjana Shalakaya Chakshur Niditam Jena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manopistam Sthapitam Jena Bhutale Swayam Rupapadam Maham Didhati Shapadantika Bande Ham Shri Guru Shri Jatapada Kamala Shri Guru Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Shagrajatam Sahagana Bhagavatam Vitamstam Sajiva Sadvaitam Savatutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Dalita Sri Vishakam Vitamscha He Krishna Purana Sindho Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Mosite Tapta Kamshana Gaurami Radhe Vrindavaneshri Prasad Hanu Sute Devi Pranamam Holy Priye Vansha Gopapurubhyasya Kripa Sindho Devasya Padita Nam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaur Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. I've been asked to say something about my experiences with Srila Prabhupada. I should start off by saying that I'm not one of those people who had a lot of personal interaction with Srila Prabhupada. Although I joined in New York at 26 2nd Avenue in 1968, I wasn't one of the original batch. The original batch means Satsarup Maharaj, Mukunda Maharaj, Kirtan Maharaj, Ray Rama, Hayagriva. They were a group, Jadrani, Kasagita. Bruce. Brahmananda, yes, of course, Brahmananda Prabhu. These were the earlier devotees. When I joined, Prabhupada had already left America. He had his heart attack and gone back to India. And I figured I'd missed everything, really. So then Prabhupada came back. And let's see, I'll see where I'm going to start here. By the time Srila Prabhupada came back, I'd already joined 2 months earlier. That's another story, some of which you'll find in my book. But I'd already joined. So Prabhupada came, he'd first come to San Francisco. That means he'd come on the western route over the Pacific. And then he came to New York. Is this too high? Is it feeding back at all? A little bit? A little bit it's pinging. It can be down, it can be, yeah, it's pinging. You can turn the volume down just slightly so it doesn't ring. Krishna, Krishna, Hare.
Hare, Hare. They were still in Second Avenue when Prabhupada came back.
Yes, his storefront was at 26 Second Avenue, and all the devotees, almost all the devotees had personal association with Srila Prabhupada, Brahmananda and Madhusudan and Devananda and Purushottam and the devotees who had known the Kishore. They've all had personal touch with Prabhupada Pralayadasa. So there was, the whole atmosphere was filled with, Swamiji said this, and Swamiji said that, and Swamiji told us this, and Swamiji told that, and Swamiji told me this, and so it's very much infused with the personal presence of Srila Prabhupada in that way. And devotees were doing things following Prabhupada as far as they were able. Srila Prabhupada came, he came, well, no, it's another occasion, but let's see. I don't want to mix visits here too much, although it's inevitable that I will. His servants at the time, personal servants, were Gaurasundar, his wife Govinda Dasi. Govinda Dasi was very attentive to Prabhupada's health, so much so that Prabhupada called her and whoever was assisting her the starvation committee, because they would put him on, they had their ideas about diet, what was good for his health, what doctors said. The Prabhupada called it the starvation committee. There was Prabhupada would give classes Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings, and on the off nights, we would go up to his apartment and he would be in a relaxed sort of mood and would talk to us about all sorts of topics, whatever he wanted to talk about or we wanted to ask about. I remember one class, one yoga society girl came. In New York at that time, there were various yoga societies which were more or less spiritual. Now the yoga societies are just overtly about health and beauty. But, okay, bring it on. So in those days, there were various yoga societies which were offering something in the way of spiritual realization of an impersonal nature. Generally, I'm God, and you're God, and you can realize that you're God. There was a poster of the day, sit still and realize that you are God. So there was a lot of that going on. And these people used to come to 26 Second Avenue who also frequented the yoga societies. And they were really tough to deal with because no matter what you said, they agreed. If you said their spiritual master was an idiot, they would smile and understand that they were sort of all-knowing because after all they were God. And everything was the same as everything else. And so just trying to deal with them, it's like trying to nail, do you have Jell-O in this country? No, anyway, trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. It was very difficult. Anyway, this one yoga society girl had been coming to our programs. A very nice girl. And when Prabhupada came, she was there for the classes. And after one class, she asked Srila Prabhupada with a sort of an all-knowing voice, expecting, I think, that Prabhupada would confirm the wise things she was saying. Swamiji, isn't it true that ultimately everything is one? And Srila Prabhupada said no. And he gave an example. He said there are 9 holes in the body. He said, but it doesn't mean that we can put food here, or here, or here. He said, no, you have to put the food in the mouth so that it goes to the stomach. So similarly, everything has to be offered to Krishna. It's not that everything is the same. He came once, but it wasn't this occasion, I don't think. Perhaps it was, but I don't remember. No, it wasn't. This was later. He came once from Honolulu, and he mentioned that the newspaper had done an interview with him, or an article about him. And they'd said that the Swami is a small man, but he has got a big message. Prabhupada like that. I went on a morning walk with him one time, and as we were coming back from the walk, around the corner from the temple was a church, and on the church there was a sign, bingo. You have bingo here in France? No. Bingo, good. So Srila Prabhupada asked, what is this bango? And bingo is a kind of a game.
Lottery.
I don't even remember how it goes, but something with, numbers.
On the red, number 7. On the blue, number 8. You had all these
Yeah, something with numbers, and
colours and numbers.
if you got the right numbers lined up in some sort of way, then
Yeah, just one. Bingo!
bingo.
Mostly old ladies,
Yeah.
60, 70-year-old ladies sat there all evening.
Yeah. So,
It was kind of gambling, small.
well, Prabhupada asked, what is it? And he said, well, it's a kind of gambling, Srila Prabhupada. And Prabhupada said, they allow. And we said, well, Srila Prabhupada, they encourage. Prabhupada just shook his head. Gambling, eating, intoxication.
In the church.
Yeah, this was the church.
That's how they maintained it.
Mm-hmm.
That's how they maintain the churches.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. I was initiated with 3 other devotees. One of them was, and this was in April of 1968, April 28th. One of them was received the name, what name did he receive? I forgot. His civil name was J. Mayo, and he was a student at Brooklyn College, and he was doing sort of work study. So he was coming to the temple, and he was taking full part in the programs, and he, at the same time, was getting credit for coming. He's a sociology student, so it was very nice. And he had his japa beads and chanting and everything. So he was initiated. along with me and 2 others. And that was the last we saw of him. Prabhupada himself performed the ceremony. He was very simple, by the way, in those days. Now you get these big gifts. Prabhupada himself, for some years, did all the ceremonies. He would have sand, and he would draw just colors. He would have some colored dyes and make some pattern this way or that way. And he himself would build a fire with sticks and pour the ghee and chant all the mantras and do everything himself. Quite simple, but impressive at the same time. So this fellow, never came again, because his purpose in coming was that he was getting credit for participating, and the culmination of his participation was to receive initiation. That was enough. He wrote his paper, and he got his credit, and he never came again. So this was his idea of how to avail himself of the association of Srila Prabhupada, chanting of Hare Krishna, to do a college paper. It was very common in those days. Prabhupada would lead the Kirtan. He would always, we would come down. Prabhupada's apartment was in the back, and the storefront was in the front. He would come down through the garden, and little garden, courtyard, then enter through the side door. And we'd be having Kirtan, waiting for him. Then he would come, we would offer obeisances, and he would sit on the platform and lead Kirtan and speak, and then lead Kirtan again. So one time we were chanting for the first Kirtan. One devotee was leading Kirtan, Sri Krishna Govinda Hare Murare, He Nata Narayana Vasudeva. And Prabhupada, and everybody was really into it. He was a nice singer, and devotees were in bliss chanting. He had a little, I forget, like a little instrument that you strummed. I forget what kind of instrument it was, but it made a nice, pleasant sound. And the devotees were happy. Prabhupada came, he sat down and said, "What is this?" He said, "Krishna, Govinda, what is that?" And now the devotees could see something was amiss. So the devotee said, "That's not bona fide, Srila Prabhupada." And Prabhupada said, "This is chanted by the Mayavadis." The devotees had picked it up from a purport in Srila Prabhupada's Srimad Bhagavatam. But Srila Prabhupada wasn't quoting it there as a mantra for us to chant. He was, like citing your authority, the way you might cite Shakespeare. If Shakespeare is somebody that carries weight for you, then if I cite Shakespeare, you call you. Or if I quote Napoleon or something. So that's one way of making an argument, is to cite someone that you accept as, your Guru accepts as an authority. So Prabhupada had referenced this mantra, but it's not that he was endorsing it for us to chant. So Prabhupada said, "This is chanted by the Mayavadis." He said we should chant what we receive from the disciplic succession. Then he said, "Sri Krishna Chaitanya you can chant." And nobody knew how to chant it in Kirtan. We'd heard the mantra, it was on Prabhupada's record. But nobody really knew how to lead Kirtan, Sri Krishna Chaitanya. Ansuduta you can, Ansuduta also didn't know. So then Prabhupada took the Mridanga and he led the chanting of Sri Krishna Chaitanya, and everybody was completely in ecstasy. The storefront was floating several feet off the ground. And that was that. Prabhupada's room was up on a few flights up in the back. And he had a room that he was using as his for taking rest and for working. And then one room on the front, like a sitting room. And the kitchen was there. And in the room what he was mainly used was very simple. There was a little blanket with some palette of elephants on it. And he had a little tin suitcase, yellow tin suitcase that he was using as a desk. And he had some, in the closet I remember he had several old typewriters. They were old even then. And, but it was sufficient for him. He was doing everything. He had a little container in which he was saving pennies that he found here and there. I'm just keeping and looking at different things I can talk about. Well, after I was initiated, the day after I was initiated, Srila Prabhupada went on to Boston, which is about 2 hours or so north of New York City by car. We had about 5 temples at that time, one in San Francisco, one in Buffalo, one in New York, one in Boston,
Montreal.
one in Montreal,
Santa Fe.
one in
Santa Fe.
Santa Fe, right. I think that was about it. Maybe 6 temples. Later we had many more. 6. And outside of New York, America and Canada, we didn't have anything. Anyway, Prabhupada went up to Boston. Govinda Dasi, his assistant and cook, was quite frail, and she needed some help for cooking. So there was some discussion, and they thought the devotees, Brahmananda was talking with a couple of other senior devotees. Satsrup Maharaj was there, the temple president of Boston. And they thought, well, maybe Devananda could go. Devananda was already, had been there before me. He was a good cook also. And then Satsrup Maharaj suggested that maybe I could go. I'd never cooked anything in my life, not at all. But somehow or other they agreed that I could go. That Prabhupada would be there for a month, so I could go for the first 2 weeks, and Devananda could go for the next 2 weeks. And if I messed up too badly, then Devananda could come earlier. That was the deal. So I went up there to Boston, and as usual, we were painting all night the night before. That was Prabhupada, wherever he went, he said it smelled like fresh paint. So we were painting and fixing and so on. And then I remember we brought Srila Prabhupada to this little house that we rented for him to stay in. And several of us, me included, fell asleep in his house. And Prabhupada said, "Who is snoring?" Prabhupada was eating very simply back then. I don't think I'll tell details about that, but very, very simple. And Govinda Dasi and I were cooking. but he wasn't satisfied with the chapatis because we had an electric stove. And for making chapatis, you want a fire. Ideally, you'd have a cow dung fire or a wood fire, at least a gas stove, but this was electric. And so with the electric stove, either it would be too hot or it would be too cold, so the chapatis would either be doughy or they'd be like crackers, and there was no way to blow them up. There's no flame. So every day, these very substandard chapatis were being given to Srila Prabhupada, and he was dissatisfied. Then the next day he was dissatisfied. Then the third day he said, "You make the dough and then call me." So we came in and we made the dough, and then Prabhupada came into the kitchen. He was only that far away. And the first thing he did is he took the skillet, the pan, and he turned it upside down on the electric burner. So now the heat was rising, and he was getting perfect heat on which to put his chapatis. And there's a system. This is still feeding back a little bit, but maybe it's okay. There's a system, maybe someone might know it. I've never seen it before. I don't think I've seen it done since, but I know that it is done. There's a system by which you can cook several chapatis in a stack. Have you seen?
We used to do it when I was the head cook in the manor. 16 chapatis at once.
Exactly. Even Swamiji never seen this. It requires mystic powers.
Requires a lot of attention as well.
It was totally astonishing to see Prabhupada put one chapati down, and then it was cooked on one side. Then he put another chapati on the fresh, on the burner, and the second chapati was flipped on top of that. And after that, it gets very complicated to explain or even perceive what goes on. But the stack keeps getting bigger up to, like Maharaj said, 16 chapatis. And there's always a fresh side going down on the burner side, and there's always a completed chapati coming off the top. And what goes on in the middle, I can't say. But Srila Prabhupada was cooking this. We couldn't cook one chapati, and now Prabhupada's cooking like 16 chapatis in a stack, and quickly. So we're rolling. Govinda Dasi and I are rolling chapatis, and Prabhupada's saying, "Faster, faster." Trying to keep up with these chapatis. But then there's still the question of, there's no burner, there's no flame on which to puff the chapati up. So Prabhupada took the grill from inside the oven of the stove, put it on the two burners on the left, and turned on the burner, electric burner. The heat came up, he threw the chapati down on the grill. Perfect. Prabhupada said that in the list of 26 qualities of a devotee, one is expert. So Srila Prabhupada was expert. And when he would cook, it was amazing to watch because he would do it with the utmost precision. As you might imagine, a surgeon doing something, or an artist just putting the right amount of some pigment. It always seemed that he was using exactly the precise amount of energy with the precise movement to accomplish the precise task that he wanted with the maximum grace and efficiency. But just seeing him do it, whatever he was doing, was so impressive. And cooking was especially attentive, fully attentive, but not strained attentive. Sometimes we're paying attention. I was just perfectly attentive, focused, and doing everything with maximum artistry. Artistry, not showy artistry, but perfect grace and precision.
Did you last your 2-week spell?
I did. I only burned a vegetable once. Again, the preparations were very simple, but one time I burned one vegetable partly. One part was burned, part was not burnt. So we were good. You know, I gave Srila Prabhupada the part that wasn't burnt. But again, his room was just that far from the kitchen. Why this vegetable is burned? You have no brain? And so he gave me a little blast. And I had to admit, I felt really fortunate to be blessed by Srila Prabhupada. Let's see. Srila Prabhupada did a lot of college engagements in Boston. Boston is a college town, many colleges in Boston. One was at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, world-class place. And there Prabhupada said that there's so many departments of study there, but why is there no department to study the difference between matter and spirit? Still, there's no such department, and MIT is busy with artificial intelligence and so on. But they haven't yet seriously taken up the study of consciousness, as far as I know. But that's what Srila Prabhupada was recommending, that this is the real science to understand what is matter and what is spirit. There was a place, Marsh Chapel, associated with Boston University, and the engagement was scheduled there, but no one came practically because it was scheduled during exam time, and so it was practically unattended. But Prabhupada spoke anyway, and for the devotees, he had Brahmananda speaking, then he spoke. And one person did come. He was a well-educated person. He knew something about Vedic literature. He asked a question about Advaita philosophy and the idea of the drop merging with the ocean, and a common example of how the soul merges with God, and as the drop in the ocean become one, so the soul and God become one. Advaita. So Prabhupada answered that it's better to become, he said, if you become a drop, then the problem is that the drop merges with the ocean, but then gets evaporated again. And it turns to rain, it goes into the clouds and they rain back onto the shore. So it's not permanently situated. He said, better to become like a fish in the ocean. If you become like an aquatic in the ocean, then you can play in the water and stay there. So in that way, maintain our individuality. There was another engagement. Did I mention this the other day? A big university, Prabhupada spoke, and afterwards in the lobby we were set up with books and prasadam and so on, and talking with the students. And, it was a big lobby, and at some point this wave went through the room. You know, like, how there's something happens, this wave goes through. So this wave went through the room, and I didn't know what had happened, but I later asked and found out that Srila Prabhupada had been talking with one Indian professor there, and the man was going on about everything is one, everything is one, everything is one. And whatever Prabhupada said, it didn't matter, everything was one. Finally, Srila Prabhupada took him by the shirt and said, if everything is one, then why don't you wear a cotton ball instead of a shirt? Cotton ball is the raw cotton as it's growing on the plant. If everything's one, why don't you wear a cotton ball instead of a shirt? So it created some stir. one time, Srila Prabhupada used to, in that house in Boston, he would sometimes in the morning sit in his sleeping room, and he would chant something. I don't think he even had a harmonium yet. Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe just kartals in the dozen kartals, or maybe he had a harmonium. Anyway, he would chant some bhajan or chant Hare Krishna, and I remember one time I was sitting there outside the door listening, and then Prabhupada, I guess, knew I was there. He said, Jayadvaita. So I came and offered obeisances. You were hearing? Yes, Srila Prabhupada. Very good.
You still call him Prabhupada Swamiji then?
Yes, Prabhupada was still Swamiji back then. It was sometime, not much later, that he became Prabhupada. But then he was still Swamiji, or even sometimes the Swami. The Swami said this, the Swami said that. In fact, that's, at some point, Prabhupada introduced G, Swami was almost insulting to call someone Swami. The custom in India is that there's an honorific affix G. Like sir, respectful. So Swamiji, Guruji, or just a personal name like Govindaji. But G signifies respect. So Prabhupada, one place, said G at least, but then not long after. I think maybe it was the same time, just about the same time. But he said actually, just Swami is third class, and he gave Prabhupada. So you can call him Prabhupada. This is another occasion. The Prabhupada had gone to, this was later, we shifted from 26 Second Avenue to a larger place down the street, 61 Second Avenue, one flight up. Quite a large space by comparison. The temple room was perhaps something of this size. 26 Second Avenue was maybe this size. Maybe it was even bigger than that. A large kitchen and some space for an ashram and so on. But Prabhupada we kept Prabhupada's apartment behind 26 Second Avenue. And which was like a 2-minute walk. And one day an elderly gentleman came to 61 Second Avenue with a letter from Srila Prabhupada. And the letter said that, yes, when I'm in New York, you're welcome to come see me. So he came, he had the letter, so Brahmananda Prabhu, the president, sent me with the gentleman to Srila Prabhupada's apartment. And there was no question of calling first, there was no phone. Just going. And the man was very respectful to Srila Prabhupada. He was connected with one of the uptown New York is 26 Second Avenue was in a very low district of New York City. The hippies were living in there, paying next to nothing for a flat. And it was just on the border of the Bowery where all the drunkards lived. It was a very funky that is to say, low-class district. But uptown Manhattan was swanky. It was high class. And mostly the yogis would set up uptown, and they would find followers among sophisticated people. So this gentleman was attending programs at one. He was connected with one such yoga society. So he came and met Srila Prabhupada and was respectful and said, he said, Swamiji, I like your movement very much. But one thing I don't understand is that your disciple said that you said that Ramakrishna is a rascal. And I always thought that he was a very holy person. And I don't know why you would say that. And Prabhupada said, who has said that I have said this? And the man said, you have not said, and you haven't said it. And Prabhupada said, if they have said that I have said, and I have not said, then they are rascals. So the other man was quite okay. So Prabhupada took a book off his bookshelf, a blue hardbound volume, Bhagavad Gita, and handed it to the man. And said, you know this book? And the man took it. It was Dr. Radhakrishna's Bhagavad Gita. And the man was very happy. Oh, Dr. Radhakrishna. And we had some connection in the Vedanta Society. Yes. So Prabhupada opened it up and to a verse in the 9th chapter and had him read the translation. The verse was Manmana Paramai Bhakta Madhyaji Mahamusku. Always think of me, become my devotee, offer your Madhyaji, worship me, and offer your homage to me. Prabhupada said yes, he is a very good scholar. He has translated very nicely. Now what does he say? Commentary. The man began reading. It is not to Krishna that we have to surrender, but to the unborn, beginningless, something, something, something within Krishna. Prabhupada said, just see. Therefore I say they are all rascals. And then Prabhupada quoted the verse, Namam Dushkrita Namudha Prapadyante Naradama Maya Pratigyana Asriyam Palamashrit. Anyone who doesn't surrender to me, who refuses to surrender to me, is a miscreant, the lowest among human beings. He's an ass. His intelligence has been stolen by illusion, and he's of demonic nature. So Prabhupada explained one by one each of these terms. Mudha Viratama, he said, it's not my saying. He said, it's Krishna's saying. What can I do? A little later, we had a community that was started, New Vrindavan, a rural community, and Prabhupada visited there. And he did an initiation ceremony in a small house at the time. And during the ceremony, which he performed, he was doing the fire. he took a stick and put the stick into the sand and pulled it up. He said, "This is very instructive." What was that? On the stick, in the sand on the stick, there was some dead moths. Prabhupada said the fire does not jump out at the moth, but the moth, being attracted, flies into the fire. He said, similarly, we're attracted by the material energy, and in this way we become subject to birth and death. Also at a similar time, he said that Maya and Krishna, he said, Krishna's there, just like your hand. If I turn my palm this way, it's in the light. If I turn it this way, it's in the darkness. He said, so we can turn toward Krishna, we can turn away from Krishna. You turn away from Krishna, we're in the darkness. You turn toward Krishna, we're in the light. We soon got a temple in San Francisco, on the west coast of America. And by that time also we had a new place in Boston, a big house, a mansion. And we set up the first printing press in that house for printing Srila Prabhupada's books. And that's the whole story. How we had presses, we had pre-press equipment, we had a whole department that was putting together Srila Prabhupada's books from start to finish. And we were very active. We had one little typesetting machine. It was a very fancy version of a typewriter, a $5,000 version of a typewriter, in fact, that would set type in columns and so on. And we kept it busy running 24 hours a day. Devotees were literally typing day and night through the Prabhupada's books. So similarly, bookbinding, everything was there. And Prabhupada was in San Francisco, and there was one Ratha Yatra in America at that time. That was the San Francisco Ratha Yatra. And that was a great occasion, a great festival. So our press manager had the idea that the whole press, all the devotees, could jump in a van and we could drive across the country, and in 3 days we'd be in San Francisco. And that way we could have Srila Prabhupada's association, the whole press would be enlivened, and we'd have the personal association with pure devotee, with our spiritual master. And then we'd jump back into the van and be back in Boston. And Prabhupada heard about it. He said, what do they want to do that for? He said they should stay there and do their service. They should stay there and do their service. That was, for him, more important than the idea that we would go to San Francisco and be in ecstasy, chanting and dancing. We should stay and do our service. I'm telling a few stories. Really, my main association with Srila Prabhupada was by service. Over the years, I met him here, I met him there. We had I asked some questions, or there was some interaction. But really, my main association with Srila Prabhupada was by service. I would be transcribing his tapes, or I would be typesetting or editing or managing book production or proofreading, or in some way working with the magazine. So I was involved in the press activities, and that was my real association with Srila Prabhupada. The personal face-to-face association was also so valuable. Lavamatra Sadhu Sangha Sadhu Siddhi. By even the moment of such association, one can achieve all perfection. Not that I did, but one can. But more important was to be serving Srila Prabhupada. To be serving his mission, he has so many books, and he wanted to publish these books, and that was my real connection. It was also, we were ahead of everyone because the books would, we'd be in the thick of working on a book, and no one else would read it for another 6 months, a year, and we were pretty slow, so sometimes it would be, a year before anyone else would read it. But we were reading it, talking about it, and so on. So we were absorbed in that way also, and felt fortunate that we were sort of, what would you say, we got the best seats in the house, or we got the, we caught the early bus, whatever you want to say, we were hearing it first. So that was one of the benefits of working in the press. But the real benefit was that we got to serve Srila Prabhupada, the artists, all the press workers were involved with what Srila Prabhupada called his heart. When he visited that press in Boston, he was touring. He saw there were 2 presses upstairs, and downstairs there were these binding machines and other equipment. And Prabhupada said, this is the heart of ISKCON. He said, this is the heart of ISKCON. And one devotee said, Srila Prabhupada, you're the heart of ISKCON. And Prabhupada said, and you know who is in the heart? So that is Krishna. So the publishing activities were dear to Srila Prabhupada's heart. One time he chastised me, why was Bhagavad Gita taking so long to publish? He said the whole world was waiting, and it's our discredit, that is my discredit, that we were saying we were so slow. He said, you promised this time, this date, but now you're saying that date. So that was he was very much eager or impatient, we could say. He wanted his books out. And he was more interested in speed than perfection. As editors and proofreaders and so on, we would be going over it and going over it and going over it. Every time you go over typeset copy, you always find new errors. We'd be going over it and going over it. And it takes time to produce books that way. It takes time. But Prabhupada, he wanted to get the books out. And so he was whipping us. We turned the books out. Well, we're supposed to go till 8. Yes, Maharaj?
With Srila Prabhupada, when he unmanifested, you could say, his pastimes of, his physical presence, or whatever you call it. Anything you can share about that? We see you there with the microphone next to Srila Prabhupada's mouth and nearby and so on and so forth.
Usually I talk about other things.
Okay.
That's a whole. What can we say? That opens a larger discussion.
Was that house with the printing presses, was it a house or was it like a...
It was a house. It was actually a funeral home. Yeah, it was a funeral home, and it had a back sort of, there was a platform that which is where they used to unload the bodies into the house. So that provided a good platform for delivery of paper.
Printing beyond birth and death.
Yes. I think 3 stories.
Probably wasn't legal to have a printing press in there, was it?
I don't know. The question never came up.
They didn't think about people doing that.
Yeah. I don't recall ever running into problems with the city over there. But it's quite likely that we also never asked permission. But it was a big house, and at that time, especially for ISKCON, it was a big house. And they got it specifically with the press in mind, to accommodate the press. I think Srila Prabhupada also contributed money toward that house.
He must have done, a lot of money spent on those machines.
Yeah, there were devotees who'd been working in the printing industry and were saving up money. Yeah. Looking back at it, I don't know where the money came from, but here and there, probably the money was collected. They weren't the most sophisticated printing presses, but they were good. The Heidelberg press, which is good press.
That was Jayadvaita, was there then, wasn't it?
Jayadvaita. He was the leader of the printing department. Heidelberg chief of the press. I remember 2 of them. I don't remember if they were both Heidelbergs. And then an IBM composer, which was the typesetting machine. $5,000.
Big thing in those days.
$5,000 that's a lot of money. Now it's not a big deal, but back then that was a lot. And still, we didn't have lavish facilities. We were, improvising and doing things in our own way. Later, the printing became unfeasible for us to run a printing when book distribution really took off, and we couldn't really keep pace. In addition to which, the fledgling press was not so expert. We printed, one of the first books was Nectar of Devotion, and Srila Prabhupada got the first copy and the pages fell out. And everything depends on proper gluing and so on. This is what they call perfect bound book, soft bound book, but it was not so perfect. And there were other things. This was a one-color press, it could print one color at a time. So to print 4 colors, you had to run the sheet through the press 4 times. And then there's something called registration, which means making sure that each time you run the sheet, you run it at exactly the same place, so that the dots in the dot pattern, the pattern that puts the colors in the right place, is preserved. And if you don't get it right, then you get, like 3 sets of eyebrows, blue one, and cyan, and yellow, and black. So we had a lot of imperfect printing there. And later we probably began printing with time upon in Japan. And he was very satisfied with their work. They're a top-rated printing company. And they could satisfy our need for big numbers.
Yes.
You told us one time the Nectar of Devotion was not properly edited.
I said that Nectar of Devotion was not properly edited. I said that.
No.
Nothing was properly edited. We did our best. Things were not properly printed, not properly edited, not properly. We did our best. And for the most part, it was quite amazing the quality of the editing. The devotees had only been devotees for anywhere from 1 to 3 years maybe, and so they weren't expert in philosophy. There were so many difficulties First of all, there's hearing Prabhupada. Prabhupada would dictate, and then someone would transcribe. And what you hear was not always what Prabhupada said. There was something called mandagreens. A mandagreen, it's a recently coined English word. It means a word that sounds like the word. Sounds like the right word, but it's not. It's plausible, it seems like it could make sense, but it's the wrong word. It comes from a ballad. The woman who coined the term, one of her favorite Scottish ballads, songs, was a song about how they killed poor Lord something or other, and Lady Mondegreen. She was very fond of that, how they killed poor Lord. I think I even had it someplace. But and Lady Mondegreen. She later learned that the correct, what the ballad actually says was that they killed Lord such and such and laid him on the green. The green being the lawn.
Lady Mondegreen.
But she heard it as Lady Mondegreen, which seemed to make sense, but it was wrong.
Lady Mondegreen.
Lady Mondegreen. So there were a lot of Mondegreens. So from that, the word has been coined Mondegreen, a word that's plausible but wrong. So there were a lot of those in Srila Prabhupada's books. There was one in Krishna book about someplace there were horse heads, but it was actually supposed to be horse sheds. There's another place where it said that Dwarka, Mathura Dwarka was surrounded by cannons, which sounded plausible, fort is surrounded by cannons, right? But, back in Krishna's day, would the fort be surrounded by cannons? So one of the translators questioned this, and they went back and heard the original tape, because the original tapes were still there for Krishna book. And what Prabhupada had said was canals. Canals, which means canals.
Oh, canals.
But Prabhupada's pronunciation was camels. So the transcriber, cannons. So there were various mistakes of that nature. And then mistakes that came from misunderstanding, just not knowing the philosophy, having to sort of do our best. So probably the most difficult, the one that had the most mistakes was Bhagavad Gita, because that was practically the first book. Then Krishna book was next, and had a lot of mistakes. Then Nectar was instruction, which also had its share of mistakes. Pretty good, actually, but mistakes. And then Bhagavatam. First canto had a lot of mistakes. At one point I fixed them with Prabhupada's permission. The fixes went in. Second canto, then gradually Bhagavatam got better, and Chaitanya Charitamrita, because by then we had Sanskrit editors. The Sanskrit editors became expert. We had typists who were traveling with Prabhupada, they could ask him a question. The Sanskrit editor himself was traveling with Srila Prabhupada, so the quality became much better. But the early books especially had a lot of errors. I corrected one this morning, by the way, in the Bhagavatam class. It talked about the Prajapatis being the lords of passion, and the demigods being the lords of goodness. And then it talked about the Lord of the ghosts, but it's plural. It was supposed to have been plural, lords of the ghosts. When you look at it, it's kind of obvious, but when we looked at it at the time of editing, it wasn't so obvious. And this is ninth canto, this is already quite late in the game. But there's always mistakes, that's part of the publishing process. You'll always find errors. And so, and especially when you're dealing with translations from another language, and especially when, with this process with Prabhupada dictating, and people who don't know Sanskrit doing the transcription, there's lots of new philosophical ideas sometimes from new pastimes. There's chances for errors. But all things considered, I think the book's in pretty good shape. Well, let me see. But, one time in New York, Srila Prabhupada came, and I gave him copies of the text that I was working on, the editing. It was fourth canto, just for his approval, so he could see. Normally we didn't, because he was traveling all over the world. There was no question of sending him things in different stages. To send him something would take maybe 2 or 3 weeks if he was in India. To send it in 2 or 3 weeks to get a reply. So you couldn't operate that way. You never did. But now Prabhupada came to New York, so I gave him a copy of what I was working on. And Prabhupada, it's all right. He said, "But why Lord Manu?" I said, "Why Lord Manu?" He said, "Lord Vishnu." He said, "Lord Narayan." He said, "But why Lord Manu?" I said, "Shouldn't it be Lord Manu?" And then I went back and listened to the tape, and Prabhupada had said Lord Manu. I don't have a conclusion for you. Prabhupada could say one thing and then say another thing. That was his prerogative. Well, what I did take away, because I puzzled over it, he's saying Lord Manu, and he's saying not Lord Manu. What I took away from it was that he wanted me to be very scrutinizing. And that was an instruction that he'd given several times. He said the editors should be very scrutinizing. That was his word, the word he used. That we should very carefully look at everything to see that it was right. Scrutinizing. One time, I did send him a question. We rarely sent, the artists would send questions all the time, but the editors would rarely send questions to Srila Prabhupada. Sometimes we did, and there were verses missing that weren't translated, or on some occasions we would send questions. But for the most part, we just had to, otherwise we just try to figure everything out. Otherwise you'd have 10 questions on a page. Prabhupada's grammar was sometimes ambiguous. There were so many questions. So we tried to figure it out on our own, which is, I think, what Srila Prabhupada expected of us. But sometimes we ask questions on one question. I sent one question about Krishna book, the 90th chapter. And there was something about there was some unclarity about what he'd said, I think. I forget exactly what the question was, but there was some unclarity. And Prabhupada just wrote on the back of the paper, Yaduvar Parishat. That was his whole answer, Yaduvar Parishat. He was translating the verse, Jayati Janani Vaso Devaki Janavada, Yaduvar Parishat Swadharabhira. So the answer was, this is the word I'm translating. You fix it. You make it right. We have Sanskrit editors there. I think Prabhupada was still there at the time. So Yadavard Parsha, that's the word I'm using. You do the needful. Yadavard Parsha. In that same letter he wrote by hand, is something to the effect of, thank you very much for your devoted service. Krishna will bless you. And he said, continue your prescribed duty and train others. Continue your prescribed duty and train others. Significant instruction. I wasn't the only person to whom he gave that instruction. He did instruct me, continue your prescribed duty and train others. Because if we only continue our prescribed duty, how will things go on? We'll monopolize the service till the end, and then everything will fall apart. So we should continue our duty, but then train the next person. And then things can expand and things can continue. Continue your prescribed duty and train others. All right, shall we stop here? Thank you all very much. Hare Krishna. All glories to the Prabhupada.
Are you putting some kind of book together with your...
No, I'm not really. I did an outline. I did an interview with Siddhanta Prabhu where I think I pretty much told everything. So, and just to go.
Published in the memories book?
Yeah. So, yeah, not with everything. Oh, I just remembered that. The name of that devotee. Okay.
His name?
Jayadvaita.
Jainarayan. You had one in London like that, too, Indian man. He got initiated, within an hour he disappeared, we never saw him ever again.
Same story? Or
No, so I don't know what his story was, we never found out. He was just an Indian man who joined the temple, was assisting, I think, secretary or something, assistant secretary after initiation. But we just heard he really just wanted to get initiated, that was it.
that was it.
Never came back.
Never came back. These things are going on.
Who would have thought?